piccoli cartelli o cartelli che giravano intorno a grandi agglomerati criminali, piccole famiglie, riescono a poter spacciare perché danno uno stipendio minore. Le aziende, come prima si diceva, entrano in crisi e quindi c'è necessità della liquidità. C'è necessità anche addirittura che loro possano stare dietro. Per esempio, alcuni clan calabresi e campani soprattutto, che sono oggi loro le avanguardie del crimine in Italia e non solo, prima si è usata una parola fondamentale, fiducia, no? I mercati non hanno più fiducia. Loro sono la nuova fiducia. Cioè un'azienda si apre, inizia a fare affari, entra in crisi, loro si presentano e per esempio ti garantiscono, ti danno fiducia perché ti garantiscono che loro distribuiranno un prodotto. Ti danno degli agenti, loro lavorano moltissimo con gli agenti del singolo prodotto, no? Agente del latte, agente della carne. Questo cosa innesca? Innesca un rapporto con l'azienda che a un certo punto si risolve nel fatto che l'azienda apre le porte e gli fa diventare o azionisti o addirittura proprietari. Quando divengono proprietari, loro mettono a stipendio i veri proprietari. Così cosa succede? Che l'azienda non è che la gestiscono loro, la gestisce il vecchio proprietario. Il vecchio proprietario è ben felice perché tutto sommato avrà garantito 4.000 euro, 3.000 euro al mese, come se fosse il capo di un'azienda, e l'azienda però è del clan. Quindi la crisi in realtà sta aprendo molte porte e in ultimo, poi finisco, in ultimo un dato sconcertante era quello dato dall'ONU qualche mese fa, in Italia abbastanza ignorato, all'estero un po' meno, che c'era l'allarme sull'entrata nelle banche dei capitali del narcotraffico. Entrata che veniva studiata, almeno all'inizio, non tanto come una pericolosità immediata, ma quanto una pericolosità a lungo termine. Ossia, se entrano oggi, soprattutto in piccole banche, piccole e medie, quello che determineranno sarà il futuro, non è il presente. Cioè, quando ci sarà la ripresa economica, questi capitali che sono entrati in queste banche, che tipo di credito daranno? Quali gruppi imprenditoriali inizieranno a sostenere? Che tipo di politica finanziaria avranno? Cioè, ci dobbiamo aspettare una ripresa determinata dai cartelli criminali? Chissà.
Misha, vorrei sapere dal tuo osservatorio invece che guarda più all'Europa dell'Est, questa crisi che impatto ha avuto e se è un'occasione per la criminalità organizzata.
Well, I think before we look at the economic crisis, let us look at the two things which converged beforehand. First of all, there's the opening up of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, which was not just the collapse of an ideology, communism, but it was also the collapse of the state, the partial collapse of the state, from everywhere from Slovenia, just up the road from here, to the Chinese border. So this huge area opened up where there was effectively lawlessness and capitalism was being created pretty much from scratch. And these areas, because there was a state of collapse, didn't have the police forces or the judicial system to deal with this. And so what emerged were spontaneous organizations that were looking after the markets. Just if we look at all the work on Naples and Sicily about the emergence of the mafia and the Camorra, about how these people were controlling markets and policing markets, that was happening all over the place in Eastern Europe in the 1990s. Now, Eastern Europe was then followed by other areas, by South America, where you had fairly protectionist economies opening up under the pressure of the United States and the European Union and Japan as they were promoting globalization. South Africa, India, China, all these areas were going through immense social and economic and political transformations. And at the same time, we had the emergence of financial capital, the movement of huge sums of money, hitherto unimaginable around the world. And so you've got a culture in the West of money being sacred. You had oligarchs all over the rest of the world with connections to organized crime and also believing that money was sacred. You got this creation of the super rich around the world where the morality was, to be perfectly honest, dubious. We see this now once the crisis has come, because some of the worst cases are emerging as a consequence of the crisis. And I would like to point out the case of Bernie Madoff, the investment banker on Wall Street in New York, who was seen as a god for more than 20, 30 years because his investment scheme paid so much money to investors. He was in fact a crook. Not only was he a crook, but by his own admission, he stole $60 billion. Now, I want us to stop and think about that, because that puts this one man and his family, Bernie Madoff, up there with the Colombian cartels, the worst of the Russian organized crime, and the 'Ndrangheta in Italy as the top earners of organized crime all over the world. And so what we saw was a criminal culture that was affecting all sorts of parts of the world. Then you get the crisis. What does organized crime do? Well, as both Loretta and Roberto have pointed out, they have to adapt to the new circumstances. Now, in these circumstances, ordinary people who are having to pay off the investment banks for their scandalous behavior through tax revenues, ordinary people have less money to go out and buy drugs and sleep with prostitutes or whatever it is else they do, which organized crime is servicing a lot of the time. So those sectors of the organized criminal economy which depend on commodities go down. Those sectors which depend on the supply of money, as Loretta and Roberto have been talking about, they go up. And then there are two other sectors which benefit from the economic collapse. The first, which is an absolutely enormous industry that Roberto has written about very eloquently in Gomorrah, is counterfeit goods. According to the European Commission, the counterfeit industry around the world is now worth about 500 billion euros a year. When you have a recession, if people are given a choice between waiting for 6 months to buy a DVD of Gomorrah, say, after it's been in the cinemas, or buying it before it's actually reached the cinemas for €1 as opposed to 15 euros at the official price, they will, in a recession, be very tempted to buy it for €1. Now, we understand counterfeit goods to operate in the area of DVDs. Counterfeit goods operate in every area. Batteries, motor car parts, shavers, parts for IKEA, not IKEA specifically, but kitchen parts and this sort of thing. Everything is being counterfeited. So this gets a tremendous boost during a recession because people have to pay less money for counterfeit goods. And the other area where we see a huge rise is the area of cybercrime, where what we've seen in the past 5 to 6 years is that traditional organized crime groups have realized that the